Tishdile. Before I start the presentation, let me very briefly introduce the speaker. We have here with us Professor Michael Davis. His expertise is on subjects like human rights, autonomy, and law and constitution.
The constitutional development.
Yeah. Which are all relevant to Tibet issue. In fact, very deeply associated. So I'm sure you all are eager to hear about what he's going to say about all these things. So without taking much time, I would request Professor to take over. Before that, as a chair, we'll keep 30-40 minutes for your talk and rest for questions and comments if you have. So in fact, Professor is much interested in interaction rather than just giving a lecture. So I request now Professor to take over.
Thank you, Tenzin. I appreciate being invited here and the work that was done at the TPI to get me here is much appreciated. As some of the old timers know, I've been here a few times before and have worked on the Tibet issue. I was actually sort of drafted into the Tibet issue years ago after I wrote an article on the case for Chinese federalism and proclaimed in the article that I didn't know enough about Tibet, so I didn't discuss it in the article. Then it was Sandom Rinpoche who invited me to India to a conference. And from then on, you guys have owned my soul. I've been writing a lot on Tibet. I'm not a Tibetologist, thank God, right? I'm just somebody who studies how governments treat autonomous regions, how governments treat ethnic national groups, and so on. And being based in Hong Kong, the government, which I study the most in this regard, is the Chinese government. So when I've been brought here, it's normally been with the idea that I would have something to say about China and its policies and so on that are deeply relevant to the Tibet issue. When I met with His Holiness the Dalai Lama this morning, that's all he wanted to talk about. He started quizzing me. You know, I was a little bit arrogant and thought I was interviewing him, but he was actually interviewing me. And that's what he wanted to talk about, Hong Kong. This was the top of his agenda. And so when I was invited here to speak, we talked first, well, what should you talk about? Because most of the time in the past when I've come here, I've written a number of papers on Tibet and I talk about it. But you know, not a lot has happened since 2008 on some of these issues. So the suggestion was made, well, maybe some comments on the white papers. But if any of you have read those Chinese white papers, you know they're nothing but propaganda. There's virtually nothing new in them. And so I suggested the Hong Kong topic, and I'm kind of glad I have, because now that I'm here, I find a lot of interest in it, because in some ways it's the leading edge of how China's been sort of treating special regions and so on in China. So I kind of divided this presentation into 4 parts. One is to tell you, in a sense, why I want to talk about Hong Kong by talking about Tibet. And that's the Tibetan Memorandum. So some questions I'm going to consider is how did the memorandum arise? Comment on the 2008 meetings that took place. What did the memorandum purport to do? And are Hong Kong developments relevant to Tibet? So these are some themes I want to pick up. And this part 1 of the paper is only a couple slides because I assume most of you kind of know about this. But the path, as many of you know, to the Tibetan Memorandum, and if I can answer the last question first, I think the Tibetan Memorandum in some ways asks for something that looks like Hong Kong. Not exactly, it's got differences, but it's a basic idea of an agreement that commits China to treat Tibet in a certain way. So the answer to the question, is Hong Kong relevant to Tibet, is via that memorandum. Because if you actually get what you ask for, you know, how reliable is it, is sort of the question that's posed. So talking about the memorandum itself, we know that in 2008, China was planning the Olympics, and the officials in China were angered by the Tibetan uprising and protest over the Beijing Olympics. They faced international pressure, and so they immediately called some meeting in Shenzhen, just across the border from Hong Kong, and then another meeting in July. In July, they asked if the Tibetans had some statement they could present to show how their middle way proposals conform to the Chinese Constitution. So that's the source of the Tibetan Memorandum. And then, of course, they used the October meeting to trash the Tibetan Memorandum, but that's sort of getting ahead of the story. So the Beijing, in these meetings that Tibetans had, and this raises a question for you whether the meetings are very useful, because in the meetings, Beijing claimed there was no Tibet problem, that China was a harmonious society, and as you see here in the slides, that the Dalai Lamas, all these discussions with Tibetans in exile are about the Dalai Lama's personal future and not China-Tibet negotiations. And then they used derogatory comments, and Dalai Lama was talking about that this morning with us, about what kind of a splitist and criminal he's accused of being, and so on, a wolf in monk's robes. The Chinese were trying one thing only. They're trying to stop trouble that was getting in the way of the Beijing Olympics. So they had the 3 stops that Tibetans were supposed to adhere to in order to have these discussions. And you see them here: stop activities aimed at splitting China, stop plotting and inciting violence, stop disrupting and sabotaging the Beijing Olympics, and then finally this request that the Tibetans prepare the memorandum. So if you look at the memorandum, we're going to find one thing. If I have time, I'm going to, on the end of today's talk, actually talk about a UN declaration on the rights of indigenous peoples. And what you'll find is that the memorandum in many ways tracks that declaration. I can't claim to have any fingerprints on the memorandum, but as your colleague here in the front row will know, I held a workshop here where we talked about the UN in 2008 in March, where we talked about the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So I think it had come onto the radar of your leaders at the time in 2008. And so some of these things that are in the memorandum are listed in the Chinese Constitution as guaranteed to Tibetans, but they're also listed as international standards in the UN Declaration. So many of you have looked at them. The list is quite familiar, I'm sure: language, culture, religion, and so on. And that there was to be a unifying Tibet, because Tibet now is broken into 13 contiguous areas in China. And then they wanted legislative autonomy, that there be no Beijing approval. This is a critical plank, because right now, autonomy under China's national minority laws requires all legislation receive Beijing's approval. The funny thing about autonomy in China today is what it really means is direct control by Beijing. That's what it means, because Guangdong doesn't have to get Beijing's approval for all legislation. Only these autonomous areas have to. So in a way, the autonomous areas are less autonomous than the non-autonomous areas. And so this memorandum tries to address that, and then we're going to consider the Hong Kong question. We know that when this memorandum was presented, they then held a press conference and released an address where they accused the Tibetans in asking for genuine autonomy of seeking a high degree of autonomy. And that high degree of autonomy is likened to covert independence. The funny thing about this is that you didn't use in your memorandum the words high degree of autonomy. Those words actually come out of the Sino-British Joint Declaration and the Hong Kong Basic Law. So they're saying Tibetans are asking for a high degree of autonomy, and they're saying that's covert independence, when in fact, that's what they've given Hong Kong. Did they give Hong Kong covert independence? So there's a kind of logical problem here, but that's what they say in this press conference. They accuse the Tibetans of colluding with democracy activists, Falun Gong elements, East Turkestan terrorists, and the request by Tibetans to control migration is likened to ethnic cleansing. And then they finally declare, we never discussed the so-called Tibet issue and never will. Many of you know they even proclaimed a Serf Emancipation Day. So they have a very strong position. The second part of my presentation, just one slide, is to show you that sitting in Hong Kong, there's a lot of things going on in China that concern Hong Kong people greatly. They tend to show a kind of emerging attitude of the Chinese government towards human rights and so on. And I've listed only a couple of them here. One is that there's a new national security law passed in China which actually lists Hong Kong and Macau as having a duty to guard national security. Now, the good news is that under the Hong Kong Basic Law, mainland Chinese laws do not apply. The only mainland laws that apply in Hong Kong under the Basic Law are mainland laws that are listed in Annex 3 of the Basic Law. And this security law is not listed there. So one can only wonder why they wrote Hong Kong and Macau into the national security law. Of course, you don't have to wonder too long. It had something to do with umbrellas, I'm sure, right? But the umbrella movement in Hong Kong has made them nervous. They also have, Chinese government on a national level has heightened control over NGOs, both domestic ones and international ones. In fact, they're passing laws now that look like they're going to make it almost impossible for foreign NGOs to function in China. And foreign NGOs have been very important in the human rights movement because they bring a lot of information on access to justice and things in China. And then, especially personal to me, was a crackdown in China on what's called Yiranping. Yiranping is a group that's organized around feminist issues. What it really came down to is women in China were starting a movement to stop men from groping them on mass transit railways and stuff. I mean, they're basically just being asked to be treated with decency. But Yiranping's feminists were all arrested. 5 of them were put in jail. 1 of them wasn't put in jail because she happened to be my student in our human rights program at the University of Hong Kong. So she wasn't there to be arrested. But when she went across the border to see her family, she wasn't allowed back. Our solution was to have her join the class, on Skype. But this is a problem. So that's another example. And then finally, over 200 human rights lawyers were arrested. And a law firm was called a criminal gang. All the law firm was guilty of is doing what every lawyer is ethically bound to do, and that is represent their client. But they were called a criminal gang. So these are just some examples, really, of climate. Give you a sense of the climate is one of crackdown under the current leadership. And then when we turn to Hong Kong, we see a whole range of things happening that I call a take no prisoners approach. So what's happening is Hong Kong's high degree of autonomy is being eroded. And I think this is very important if you're asking for autonomy from China to see. One of the problems I think, why are they doing this? I just think it's not in their DNA to run an open society. They don't know quite what to do when students take to the streets and occupy the streets and protest, and they don't know what to do with them. I mean, sometimes it's as simple as that. For the first decade or so, they had a policy, just keep your fingers off of Hong Kong. But Chinese communist leaders are not good at keeping their fingers off of things, as the Dalai Lama discovered in the 50s. They just keep getting and reaching and grabbing. And so they start making statements that Hong Kong has a confused and lopsided view. The confused and lopsided view is that the basic law of Hong Kong guarantees basic freedoms, democracy, and human rights, and the rule of law. And in their view, the way in fact, they particularly dislike members of my faculty in the University of Hong Kong law faculty because they say we're misleading students. And so they've particularly attacked us. They've attacked our university and so on. But that's getting a little bit ahead of the story. During a whole year of protest in Hong Kong, they showed no sign of compromise, no sign of accepting the reform demands. We saw a Hong Kong government, this is another problem for autonomous regions, is the government in Hong Kong is completely submissive to the central government. They're always lecturing Hong Kong people on what the central government requires, never lecturing the central government on what Hong Kong requires. In fact, I wrote a whole series of op-eds in the newspaper over the past year, even won a Human Rights Award over it. But when the last op-ed I wrote was to accuse the Hong Kong government of not having a voice. Not that it's supposed to challenge and fight with the central government. Obviously, it can't get away with that. But to just have a voice, to say what Hong Kong people are concerned about. And the first time of all the op-eds I wrote, about 30 of them, This one here got a response from the chief executive of Hong Kong, saying Professor Davis doesn't understand that we can't question the central government on anything. So if you got an autonomous region, one of the problems is going to be, can it speak? Does it have a voice? And under that system, it's very difficult. Increased pressure on universities, the media editors have been beaten up in the street, one of them almost killed. Our universities have come under attack. Even they tried to institute a system of patriotic education in Hong Kong. They called national education. But our secondary students all took to the street in protest. And they made such a big stink that the government had to back down from it. And the same with our universities. They accuse us of misleading our students. The Occupy movement that you probably saw in the newspapers came out of my university. And they accuse us of misleading our students with confused and lopsided views. So this is sort of the situation. It wasn't always that way. It's sort of like Beijing has gone from, in 1984, Hong Kong people, put your hearts at ease. Now the message is Beijing is the boss. It's just the tone of their treatment is very different. This here's just a slide showing all the promises made in 1984 Sino-British Treaty. One country, two systems, high degree of autonomy. There's those words. Hong Kong people ruling Hong Kong. The basic constitutional requirements under the Sino-British Treaty and eventually the Basic Law is the legislature chosen by elections, the chief executive by elections or consultations, the rule of law to be maintained under the common law, courts to be independent and final, and a list of 16 different rights that I safely call liberal because half of them are free speech. You know, freedom of research, freedom to organize labor unions, all these sort of subcategories of free speech. So the tone was, as I said a moment ago, put your hearts at ease. And now China claims that Hong Kong is totally an internal affair, but China internationalized Hong Kong. They put it in a treaty, and then they went to the capitals of the world and asked governments all around the world to treat Hong Kong separately from China for purposes of custom, trade, airport agreements, you name it. They're asking governments to rely on Hong Kong's high degree of autonomy to treat it separately. So if the autonomy is eroded, should those governments still treat Hong Kong separately? Or should they respond saying, no, you can't do that because we're giving Hong Kong people get visas easily to any country on earth. They're treated like if they lived in England. They have all this access to the world. Is that going to continue if Hong Kong's autonomy is eroded? Okay. So again, when you get an autonomous region, it's not a general autonomy, fist in the air. It's more complicated. It's all these details. It's all these things that matter. And then the basic law, the Sino-British Treaty stipulates that the treaty itself and Annex 1 of the treaty, all these guarantees, is to be included in a basic law of Hong Kong. And the basic law is to be binding in Hong Kong like a constitution. Okay? And in that treaty, it says the governments agree to implement all of it. It's supposed to go on for 50 years. So that'll become relevant in a minute. And the basic law more or less did that, except in two areas. One area is it was weak on the rule of law because it gave the National People's Congress Standing Committee final review over matters involving local central relations and central authority. So the finality of the courts in Hong Kong, which was promised in the treaty, is somewhat under suspicion because now if it involves local central relations or central authority, the Court of Final Appeal is supposed to send it to the NPC Standing Committee to give an interpretation. So that kind of, in the basic law itself, undermines the independence and finality of the local courts, the ability to maintain the rule of law. And it got worse because a case came up called the Right of Abode case, where the Hong Kong Court of Final Appeal refused to refer the matter as specified in the basic law, and the government of Hong Kong went over the court's head and referred it, and Beijing accepted it. So now it means that whenever the government doesn't like what the Court of Final Appeal is doing, there's an implicit threat. Look, if you don't agree with us, we're going to take it to Beijing. And so then the press is always asking the government, are you going to take it to Beijing? And so on. So the rule of law depends on independent and final courts. This is one weakness in the basic law. And the other weakness was the one you saw on the street last summer, which is a kind of foot dragging over democracy. And so why democracy? Well, the Hong Kong students on the street were claiming that the Chinese government had to fulfill its commitments under Article 45 of the Basic Law, which promises that the chief executive will be elected. The ultimate aim, it says, is that the CE, the chief executive, be elected by universal suffrage upon nomination by a broadly representative nominating committee in accordance with democratic procedures. That universal suffrage, China says, well, universal suffrage doesn't mean the same thing everywhere. Duh. Does it really mean something different everywhere on the planet? And then the nominating committee. Oh, well, we're going to set up a nominating committee, it's like the Guardian Council in Iran, where we'll decide, who gets nominated. But yes, there will be universal suffrage because everybody will get to vote. So is that universal suffrage when everyone can vote, but only for candidates selected by the regime? Okay, so this was what the students were protesting about. And I would add a footnote here. They're not just protesting about this. At the end of the day, what upset Hong Kong was the perception that Hong Kong's autonomy was being trashed. That the system that was being put in place was designed to give Beijing ultimate control over everything. And the whole promise of autonomy, one country, two systems, put your hearts at ease, is being eroded. We see it in a number of ways in Hong Kong. We see the former chief secretary has been convicted of corruption. The former chief executive is now under prosecution for corruption. All of them because of their relationship, sweetheart deals with mainland officials. So the mainland system seems to be creeping across the border. And Hong Kong people are very free-spirited. And they're also willing to speak up. So they've come to the streets protesting, not just that they're denied democracy. Why do they want democracy? Because they see a Hong Kong government is unwilling to defend them, unwilling to defend their autonomy. So how do you get your autonomy defended? By having a democratically elected government. Can it be one that Beijing selects the candidates? Well, that ain't going to work, because then it's going to behave like the existing one. So they want a government that will represent Hong Kong's interest. Why do they want a government to represent Hong Kong's interest? To defend Hong Kong's autonomy. Why do they want autonomy? The highest value in Hong Kong is the rule of law. That no one is above the law, everyone is subject to the law applied in the ordinary manner. So this is what's at stake. Now, Beijing already started eroding this promise of democracy in 2004 by saying that Hong Kong had to go to Beijing to even propose a change. Before then, the Basic Law itself says that the legislature can be made fully democratic without Beijing's approval. You just had to report it for the record. Now, under this 2004 decision, it seems to say now you have to go to Beijing for any change. What it did is it amended the Basic Law without going through the process of amendment. So what Hong Kong is confronting is a central government that thinks amendment and interpretation are more or less the same thing as it is on the mainland. So the notion of amendment itself is at issue. The notice of what it means to interpret a law is at issue, because on the mainland there's a lot of freedom in interpreting laws and so on. Finally, the government in 2007, the central government, promised that Hong Kong could have its universal suffrage in 2017, except it suggested that this nominating committee that's required may be formed with reference to the existing election committee. The chief executive that's chosen now is elected by an election committee, not by the people at large. And the election committee is heavily pro-Beijing. It comes from these functional sectors that support Beijing. So historically, for the first three chief executives, 90% of its votes go to pro-Beijing candidates. Pan-democratic candidates, the Democrats, have run candidates just to test the system. But the most they can get is about 10% of the vote, because the election committee is like the guardian council in Iran. It's heavily pro-Beijing. So Beijing is suggesting already in 2007 that we use the election committee as a model. Now, I can give you a fast forward. They ultimately demand and require the election committee be the model. So again, this is a form of erosion. Now, the Basic Law also incorporates the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Hong Kong is the only jurisdiction I know that has photocopied the ICCPR and enacted it as a legislative Bill of Rights and incorporates the ICCPR into the Basic Law of Hong Kong, the Constitution, under Article 39. So when China says universal suffrage can mean whatever we want it to mean, we were out on the street saying otherwise. I was on the street all the time. My colleagues were on the street. They were boycotting the university, so we were conducting classes on the street. So this is a kind of thing that was going on. The students even set up a study hall. When they occupied the street, they had a study hall on the street. And students were going around sweeping the streets. They were tidying up their tent city. So this idea that ICCPR would allow Beijing to create a pro-Beijing election was challenged. And that's what the protest movement was all about. You see in Article 25 of the ICCPR, it says every citizen shall have the right and opportunity without distinction and without unreasonable restriction to vote and to be elected at genuine periodic elections, which shall be by universal and equal suffrage. This is what Hong Kong was demanding on the street. But it was also demanding a rule of law, because Beijing is taking such liberty. You can't have the rule of law if the persons who interpret the Bill of Rights take complete liberty with it, okay? And people understood that. So beyond what the press reported, there was deeper concerns. What I did on a couple of slides here is ask questions. China also at the time wrote a white paper. The white paper was, like you see on Tibet white papers, there was a white paper on Hong Kong. You can Google it, the white paper on Hong Kong, and you'll find it, okay? And in that white paper, that's where they said that Hong Kong people had a confused and lopsided view and started offering different view of the Basic Law. So what they did is their tone changes in the white paper from put your hearts at ease to Beijing is the boss. A high degree of autonomy, we are now told, is not full autonomy, okay? I would think a high degree of autonomy would be higher than full autonomy, because it's a high degree of autonomy, but they're told in the white paper otherwise. One country, two systems now, they say, is solely from the authorization of the central leadership. So they're taking total authorship of the one country, two systems model, even though they wrote it into a Sino-British treaty. Now they're saying, oh, we cooked up this model, and they actually quote the 12 articles of the Joint Declaration verbatim, and then say, we authored these before the treaty was signed. So these come totally from the central government, okay? So in effect, they're diminishing the importance of the international treaty by which they took back Hong Kong. So beware, you sign agreements, how they're going to treat the agreements. Of course, Tibetans know about 17-point agreements. Footnote here, most people think that Sino-British, the one country, two systems model is a copy of the 17-point agreement. So your original agreement is thought to be the prototype of what's being done in Hong Kong, okay? So anyhow, so now they're saying this, and then in London they made diplomatic representations that the Sino-British treaty is now dead. It's dead now, no longer needed, we've completed it. Even though Article 7 of that treaty specifically says that all the two parties agree to fulfill all the requirements in the treaty, including 50 years of high degree of autonomy and everything, but now we're told that it's dead. So this is one area where Hong Kong is very nervous, and one thing that's stimulating these protests. Another thing is the rule of law. Now we're told in a white paper that the NPC Standing Committee can interpret or amend the Basic Law as it prefers, that it has comprehensive jurisdiction, that it can supervise Hong Kong legislation, even though there's no specification in the treaty or the basic law about supervising Hong Kong. It now characterizes judges as administrators or governing officials. Even the Hong Kong Bar Association attacked this. It emphasizes the judge's role in guarding national security and so on. So this diminution of the rule of law in there, and then even the one country, two systems model is diminished by this accusation that people in Hong Kong have a confused view, the national security law that I just mentioned, and so on. And then finally, what about democracy? It says very little about it, but it does tell us in the white paper that the election committee, the one I said that is pro-Beijing, is said to be an expression of equal representation and broad representativeness. So they basically rename everything. No matter what promises are made, they're made now into something different. And I mean, I'm not saying anything that's controversial. I wrote this all in op-eds over many months. So I guess if Beijing gets a hold of your recording here, they already have enough on me. But Hong Kong government did a consultation of the public. A consultation of the public lasted about 5 months. And it came back with all of these outrageous claims, which again angered the people on the street. Claims such as the mainstream opinion in Hong Kong favors exclusive power in the nominating committee. The community generally agrees that a chief executive must love the country and love Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, love the country, love Hong Kong is code for not being Democrat. That excludes Democrat. Everyone, Beijing, when you deal with Beijing, there's always code. Words have, different meaning than you might imagine. That relatively more views agree that the nominating committee be like the election committee. Considerable views favor increasing the seats. This is the Hong Kong government report on consultation with Hong Kong over democratic reform. So while you guys are trying to get China to talk to you at all, Hong Kong has all this stuff. And now you're seeing when you dig beneath the surface that controversy appears everywhere. So being aware of this is why I want to talk about this today. Being aware of this to me is not insignificant. Basically the tone of the rest of it is more or less the same. So then finally the standing committee makes its decision, and that's when they embrace turning the nominating committee, using the election committee as the nominating committee. In effect, they create a committee that guarantees pro-Beijing candidates are the only ones that can be presented to the voters. That's what they've done. This committee is elected, but elected by a minority of constituencies that have always been pro-Beijing. And so that's what they do. And to make it safe for themselves, they even require that any person nominated has to have more than 50% of the vote in the nominating committee. So just in case a Democrat snuck by, they won't sneak by that one, okay? So this is kind of what happened. And then it was on the government, Hong Kong government then, based on this approval, to come up with an electoral bill. And it comes up with a bill, and it doesn't do anything to try to get around any of this. It literally does exactly what Beijing tells it to do without any sort of, there were some areas of wiggle room. In the first consultation, Democrats, including myself, I even wrote I submitted a document to the consultation committee, which I had written as an open letter in the newspaper. And I submitted it to the consultation committee. And most of the submissions in the first consultation came from the pan-democratic camp. In the second consultation, we boycotted the consultation. And so the submissions only came from the pro-Beijing camp. And even moderate proposals from the pro-Beijing camp were all uniformly rejected. And so that's where it was, and the government came up with its bill. And the Democrats had one thing in their hand. And that is to pass this bill under the basic law required a 2/3 vote. And they have just over 1/3 of the seats. So they killed the bill. And so Hong Kong is back to square one on democracy because they killed it. You can see from our discussion why they killed it. They were told they should pocket it, its improvement. But they felt if they pocketed this, they would be stuck with it forever. And so they voted it down. And it was funny because the pro-Beijing guys, they got up in the legislature for some idiotic reason, decided they were going to walk out during the vote. And they walked out. So only 8 legislators out of 70 voted for the bill. And so even the pro-Beijing camp was embarrassed. And Beijing was embarrassed because its whole year-long saga resulted in zilch. Nothing came out of it. And then, were the protests justified? Big debates occur in Hong Kong. When is civil disobedience justified? I had debates on the BBC when I was standing in the street, in the middle of the street in a tent city, with a Beijing official, and the Beijing official was saying, those protesters are breaking the rule of law. That's what he said. So I educated him a little bit and said, you don't break the rule of law. They're not breaking the rule of law, they're breaking the law. Civil disobedience is intentional breaking the law, not breaking the rule of law. Now, okay, fine. You mean they're undermining the rule of law. And I ask, who's undermining the rule of law? Are people engaged in civil disobedience to guard the rule of law? Think Martin Luther King, Birmingham, Alabama, 1960s. Is that person undermining the rule of law? Or are Beijing officials and Hong Kong officials who take total liberty with the promises of human rights and just do whatever they please, are they the ones that's undermining the rule of law? Who's doing it? Okay. So this was the texture of the debate. Some of it I had an opportunity to get involved in. Was the protest a failure? This is one of the things you can ask about 2008 in Lhasa as well. When you don't get what you want, is it a failure? I say no. I think when a bunch of kids in Hong Kong stand up and speak truth to power and the whole world watches and they capture the global imagination, you can't really erase that from the mind. Just like 1989 can't be erased from the mind, 2008 can't be erased from the mind, in Xinjiang 2009 can't be erased from the mind. Even though you don't always get what you want, you've now sort of put on notice what's going on. That Hong Kong people's solemn promises in international treaties, human rights, democracy, rule of law are under threat. So to me, that's a success. They didn't get the ultimate aim, which was a genuine democracy. But this is tough. As Tibetans know, 60 years later, it's a long slog. But I think something was said inside the area ruled by China by a bunch of young people in Hong Kong that the world heard. And I think even China's foreign friends, frenemies, if you will, know about it as well. So I think I'm not so hard. I never take the view. I'm asked frequently by the media whether it was a failure. And now I return us to Tibet. So we know all these laws in China on autonomy and PRC's Article 4 of its Constitution. I've given lectures here on that before, so I won't spend a lot of time on it. We know the notion of autonomy in China, where Tibet is under Chinese rule, is often not just a matter of what the law and the Constitution says, but of Marxist doctrines, the Communist Party, all these elements add up. Just like in Hong Kong, a whole complex set of things are controlling the outcome. And so you're sort of in the same picture. I want to point out that there's a UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that tracks your memorandum. I note here in this slide that a lot of other kinds of things, there's not much international law on autonomy. There's not much help. But the UN Declaration, which is here in the next slide, looks a lot like the Tibetan memorandum. So I think there's some consciousness of this idea that there's an international standard. Whether an international standard on indigenous people, China, we know, voted for the UN Declaration, but promptly declared there were no indigenous people in China. But we don't have to accept their views, just like Hong Kong kids didn't accept their definition of universal suffrage. Okay? So this is an open question. Is it a concept to be used? The Tibetan memorandum, as far as I know, is the first time when Tibetans in exile actually use the word indigenous. That word is inside the memorandum. It's not emphasized in the memorandum, but it's in there. So this idea floats in the background. I think there's some worry here that if you use that concept, that it's surrendering the outcome that you're just indigenous and not allowed of independence or something before you even have discussions. So while the indigenous concept in the UN Declaration tracks your memorandum perfectly, there has been some nervousness about using the concept which has historically been applied in the Americas and so on. But I think it lurks in the background as a standard. And when I speak to international diplomats, and I frequently do that, I do say, you guys should support the memorandum. I'm always promoting this memorandum. I know the Chinese government's not interested, but I think when you're talking to diplomats, they're certainly not going to support Tibetan independent activists, and I greatly respect those activists. They're encouraged to take the view they honestly have. But when it comes to foreign governments, the most you're going to get out of them is support for the memorandum. So I kind of encourage that idea. This is the last time I met His Holiness the Dalai Lama. You can see I'm wearing my home shirt from Hawaii, which is where I'm from. But in any case, now I want to open this up for discussion. I hope I haven't taken too long. It's a complex story that I had to tell, but I hope you sort of get the idea. Its complexity is the story in a way, because it gets down to the root meaning of constitutional concepts, even ones you're applying to your exiled government. You know, you have democracy, you want to adhere to principles that respect human rights, equality of Tibetans, and so on. So this kind of constitutional thing can't be swept around in like one slide or so, but I hope I've told the story efficiently enough so you sort of get the idea if you've not been following it carefully already. And so I open the floor to discussion at this point.
Tiwa ine kari comments kari ine di nang shui tunduchi.
Yes.
So, to what I mean, given the complexity of it, effectively, whatever happened in Hong Kong did not lead to any tangible outcome in favor of Hong Kong. Do you think this is going to have a chilling effect on prospective protest movements for any of these, I think, minorities in China? So Hong Kong, what kind of example is Hong Kong? Should they feel encouraged by it, or should they feel discouraged by it?
Well, I think it is a kind of this itself has a complexity, because the Hong Kong case clearly showed the Chinese government is becoming more severe and more repressive in its tactics towards these peripheral regions. And so on the one hand, it could discourage, it might make Tibetans say, well, the heck with this is futile dealing with these guys, because look, if we even got our memorandum, then we'll just wind up with the same problem Hong Kong has, except it'll be worse for us, because our memorandum actually isn't as good as the Sino-British Treaty and the Basic Law. It surrenders more than those agreements do, because you accept some kind of Communist Party rule and stuff under the memorandum, which was a move that I wasn't too keen on personally, but I respect your judgment, because I know you're dealing with a difficult adversary. But so yeah, on the one hand, it seems to say, well, maybe it says if middle path is not going to work, maybe we should go be more aggressive because we have nothing to lose. That might be one message, although at the same time you're faced with this all near impossibility of fomenting rebellion in Tibet. So it is a very severe message that this government, as it is now, poses a real challenge to the aspirations of Tibetans. So that's one message. But I think another message is that there's a kind of encouragement from these young people. They're still out there protesting. That particular set of activities, the umbrella movement, had to end, and it has. But, Chinese government apparently felt it couldn't just march in like it did into Tiananmen Square. So, in fact, the way it finally felt found to deal with the problem was passively. Instead of cracking down, as it started out using tear gas and everything, that's why the umbrellas, to deflect the gas, it finally realized that that was just stirring up people. It was getting more and more people to the street. So then it sort of changed tactics and kind of let them in the street. And they just sat there to rot. And after a while, the tents got emptier and emptier and so on. So I think there's also a kind of encouragement that, persist. That you're not going to, Hong Kong students didn't get what they wanted right away. You guys certainly haven't got what you've wanted after many, many years. But this government can be challenged. It's not, invincible. That the world's sentiment, just as in 2008 over Tibet, the world community does notice. And the Chinese government in some ways is exposed. And maybe we should take heart from that. That's why I don't want to say it's a complete failure. I think there's a success element in it. And if that's true, there is some element of encouragement, but I don't want to, be Pollyannic about it. Of course, the situation for Tibetans, for minorities in China, or even Han Chinese seeking their human rights protection right now is not good. But maybe there's some idea in all of this, because it was quite stunning to watch these young people standing up to this hardline regime. It almost looked like 1989. So, I want to credit that. And I think what it does, though, it does make us a little more conscious that maybe the memorandum itself isn't that good. It isn't enough, that even if you get it, you might get nothing. There's a message like that in there right now, which means that it sort of invests a lot of us in hoping that more substantial change might occur in China, to where you get a government that's more sensitive to people's concerns, and how that kind of reform process can unfold. I mean, there are political economy arguments that a regime that has a successful economy will eventually liberalize itself. And I think people are hoping for more of that and engaged in efforts at that, in encouraging the human rights, rule of law, and so on in China. But it is sort of saying to us there's a bit of a long slog going on here. It's a long process. It's not going to happen overnight. Yes?
I think Chinese always try to interpret the words which they have promised. So as you say, the Constitutional agreement. In both of the Tibetans, they just went against it, and we are fully aware of that. And at the same time, also Hong Kong's basic law.
Yeah.
That too, I think now a Chinese government is trying to interpret their own way, and that's a Chinese communist tactic. They always do that. Yeah. So another thing is, what I want to ask you is the basic law on all constitutional systems was agreed upon with peoples belonging to China and UK.
Yes.
So because of that one, as long as 17-point agreement of consent is between two countries or two parties,
yeah.
But then you have a third country regarding Hong Kong. Yeah. So when the Chinese government do not respect the promises they have made, don't UK has any kind of say in that? So I think that because like in the past also you have the other countries like Portuguese helping East Timor to get independence, and all the same way you have Austria helping South Tyrol and all that sort of thing. But British was a part of that. So doesn't British have some kind of say in implementing the rights which the Chinese have promised
in the treaty?
In the treaty.
Right.
That's one.
Yeah.
Number two is, now, unlike in Tibet and China, whenever there are peaceful protests, Chinese suppress them and all that stuff, they treat badly. But in case of Hong Kong, the Chinese can't do that. They apply all kinds of repressive policies, and they send gangsters and thugs too to suppress and discourage the young people to take part in that. So, don't you think that Hong Kong young people and Hong Kong people do much more, because after that umbrella revolution and all that sort of thing, slowly it all boiled down and nothing happened. So why can't they sustain that kind of movement?
Yeah, okay. On the British, yes, the British have really let Hong Kong down. There's a general perception there. We know that at this time when all this was happening, Xi Jinping and the other leaders were being invited to UK, deals were being made, and it seems George Osborne, I think George is the right, Osborne at least is his surname, in the UK is promoting this idea that the UK's economy is going to be built on its relations with China, which of course is a big problem that Tibetans have, that Hong Kong has, that the British and other governments are not willing to stand up to China because they have trade deals and everything, and their leaders are being, treated to meetings with the Queen of England and everything else. And so the Chinese seem to have tamed the British. And I was invited to the British consulate in Hong Kong with some other activists, and all the British consul general could do is tell us, oh, we should take the deal that the Chinese government's offering. It's okay. So while it's so clear, as I laid out here today, that this deal violates the Sino-British Treaty, it's not ambiguous at all. The British have no voice in it. So what I think Hong Kong people expect, they don't expect the British to do anything significant, but they do expect them to speak, to at least say that we think this is violating commitments you've made, especially when the diplomats in England are announcing that the Sino-British Treaty is dead. It's not dead by its own terms. Its own terms in Article 7 says it's not fulfilled until it's over in 50 years. So the British could find a voice on any of this, but they did not. So it's just, that's the case. What's happening on the streets in Hong Kong is a problem, kind of a common problem for protesters. And that is, how do you sustain a protest movement in the face of public, what I call protest fatigue? When they're blocking a major thoroughfare in Hong Kong and everyone's having to get around it to get to the central district, to go to work and everything, after a while, people just get tired of it. This is why suggestions were made by more mature people that maybe you should withdraw, show that you can withdraw, and then come back. But one of the problems you have with protest movement is lack of discipline. When Benny Tai and others conceived of this so-called Occupy Central movement, they were conducting classes on how to engage in nonviolent struggle and everything. And people were told how to do it and this and that. And all this discipline was brought in. And then what happened is the students jump-started the protest. He wasn't going to start until October 1st, and they started in late September by boycotting classes and doing things. And by the time before October 1st even arrived, they had occupied the area around government offices, which is not even in Central. It's in Admiralty, the adjoining district. And so the result was that protests got ahead of the protest leaders. And so eventually it was the students leading the protest instead of the organizers of this idea of civil disobedience and nonviolence. So this became a problem, and those older, more experienced guys had no control over it. At the same time, the student leaders didn't have control over other protesters either, because some more radical protesters would join the protest. You can imagine if Tibetans were trying to have protest over autonomy, but some of your more radical groups got involved in the protest, and so when you guys were being too mild, they started taking more aggressive action. So this was the problem the protest leaders were having. And so this created an inability to withdraw and come back, withdraw and come back, which we saw, by the way, with Solidarity in Poland years ago over their protest against communism. They showed they had as much discipline to pull out as they had to get in. If you have discipline for your protest social movement to end and start, then you're telling the leaders in both actions that you're capable of delivery, that whatever you're threatening to do, you're capable of delivering it. But in this case, government quickly learned after a few mistakes that, we just leave these guys there to rot. And so they're occupying the whole street and the police are leaving them alone, the government's leaving them alone, and eventually, when it looks like the public support has waned because people are tired of it, then they start moving in and clearing areas. At this point, there was no chance of stopping it. What has fallen out of it is something the Chinese government probably doesn't like. And that is there's actually an underground sort of independence movement now in Hong Kong. Some of them are less radical than others. Some of them think Hong Kong should be independent, and never was an independence movement before the umbrella movement in Hong Kong. But now there is one, but it's small. And there's another one called a localization movement. So pretty much all the movements are hostile to mainlanders. And some of them just directly to mainlanders, not just the mainland government. They don't like, as you can imagine, a lot of Tibetans don't like mainland tourists either in Tibet. I've been there and I've seen them, and sometimes they can be quite obnoxious. A lot of Hong Kong people also are getting antagonized by mainlanders. Mainlanders come into Hong Kong to take away baby formula. It was funny, I wrote an op-ed in the press accusing the government of not defending Hong Kong's autonomy, saying that autonomy regimes are designed to have the government defend autonomy. When the chief executive responded, he says, yes, we are. Professor Davis doesn't understand we can't do anything constitutional, but we defend autonomy in other ways because we stopped mainlanders from taking baby formula out of Hong Kong. When he said that, all I could do was laugh. You know, I won that argument. Because he looks so stupid. The chief executive of Hong Kong's only defense that he's defending Hong Kong is he's stopping people from smuggling baby formula out. You think it was heroin. But so this is what it comes down to. So now there are these movements. The district council election was held this past week, and Beijing was thumping its chest saying, oh, we're going to really win now because everybody's tired of those troublemaker Occupy guys. But 8 of the occupiers actually won seats in the district council. And the number of seats held, because historically the pro-Beijing camp has a lot of money and a lot of district organization. So it always wins the district council elections. It loses the legislative council elections. So it wins there, but its seats were reduced at least. And some of these new Turks are in there. So what's emerging in Hong Kong now is the old guard Democrats are having to give way to this new generation of pro-democracy people. So this is one of the problems I'm sure you have here and they have in Hong Kong, is rejuvenating a protest movement. Your protest movement is called an exile government, but it's still a protest movement. I know when Lobsang Sangay came in, so bring in some new people and stuff. This is vital. You need to be able to rejuvenate movements. I know as a guy who's getting old myself that I don't like being the butt of rejuvenation because then I'm pushed out, but that's kind of what's needed. You need this kind of thing. So that's happening in Hong Kong. So what's happening are a number of things that are changing the complexion. What you want to watch for is not the district council elections. We want to see what happens next year in the legislative council elections. So that's going to tell us where the political sentiment is at. And then the next things is going to be what kind of, who's going to take over as chief executive, and whether whoever's in that position is going to start being willing to deal with these public concerns. Right in the middle of the movement, I actually went to Beijing because they invited me to give a lecture at Peking University. Believe it or not, I gave the same lecture I just gave you today in Peking University. And my dean was there with me, and he said I kept looking at the door to see if the Public Security Bureau was going to come in. But I gave the same talk. The Tibet part wasn't in there. I was talking about Hong Kong only. But I gave that same account. I just labeled it Hong Kong Perspectives on the decisions made by Beijing. And I said what I want. The next day, I was invited to Tsinghua University to have dinner with the dean. And he first told me, he says, oh, I heard about your talk yesterday. So whatever you're saying gets around. So it does matter to get your voice out, okay? Even today, before today's meeting, this meeting, I met with TPI people. I actually want to see their work get out. I don't think it's enough that you put it in reports that are kept here in that drawer, wherever you put all these reports, but that it has to be published in venues that get out to the world, because it does affect people. And I wanted to say that here because I was encouraging our colleagues there to try to do that, but I know some more senior colleagues are sitting here, so I want you to be aware that this is quite important, that we're always looking for that stuff to be published. And so it's something that's very important. And I think that's what's going on, is more and more messages. And so that's why I still say the protest is a success, in the sense that people all across China, even though China tried to block it from the media, trust me, it got in. And they know that their own government that people are doubting about their government's commitment to these things. That's something. Anybody else? We still have 15 minutes on our calendar if you have questions or comments. Otherwise, you all want to go home and get out of here. I appreciate that. Anybody?
I can.
Yes.
So something that I was wondering while your presentation was going on is the memorandum. So when whatever China accepted for Hong Kong, once it was acceded, it was also forced to let two-country model be accepted, because many Hong Kong citizens were otherwise not threatening in direct sense, but otherwise they would have left the UK because English offered them many countries. They could have gone to many countries because they were a highly skilled population, and China wanted to retain them.
Yeah.
And therefore China in a way agreed and accepted, or sort of conceded to many of the demands,
Right.
and said, okay, let's do this. Now in the light of that, there are two things that emerge. One is, what will happen to the memorandum here in Tibet, given the fact that there is no such kind of skilled immigration threat that China has from Tibet.
Right.
And second, even though China has this threat that Hong Kong could suddenly be out of the picture, and we want Hong Kong to retain because it gives us so much money, taxes and other things, that kind of advantage China may not see in Tibet or Uyghurs or any other ethnic minorities.
Right.
So what would be the future of sort of the memorandum, keeping the protest aside? Just because you're trying to relate to situations where, and I think Hong Kong and Tibet have their different starting points altogether with China. And knowing these two different starting points, China sort of, with whatever infamous attitude it had, managed to crush that protest.
Yeah.
So if you could crush that, you know what I'm saying? Like still trying to build the case for the kind of discouragement it still has for me particularly. But even keeping that protest aside, what do you think about the memorandum itself?
Well, the thing to bear in mind is when the Sino-British Treaty was being negotiated, it wasn't originally even thought to be a treaty. That Margaret Thatcher was talking to Deng Xiaoping, and the British convinced them that a treaty would be a way to secure confidence, because the Chinese, Deng Xiaoping's government had released a statement in 1982. The Sino-British Treaty was signed in 1984, had released a statement indicating what China's policies would be on Hong Kong. And this, they didn't threaten, they packed their bags. Hong Kong people were immigrating in large numbers into Canada, UK, and other places. And it caused a panic in Hong Kong. So the original Chinese design for Hong Kong wasn't substantial enough to restore confidence in Hong Kong. So this went through this treaty negotiation, and Deng Xiaoping apparently was ultimately convinced that they needed an international agreement to secure confidence in Hong Kong. Otherwise, the Chinese government was going to be greatly embarrassed if Hong Kong collapsed as soon as it took power. And so this is the basis of it. And so it restored confidence because it was significant to Hong Kong people. I mean, when I write about this, I'm not trying to bash China. I'm actually trying to tell China, look, if you fulfill your commitments, Hong Kong is no problem for you. Hong Kong people aren't very political in the first place. They're becoming so only because they face a threat to their identity, their existence. Well, the same with the Tibetan Memorandum. There's a really good case to be made. In fact, the obvious case is that if China were to talk now to the Tibetan government. You know, when I write the case for Chinese federalism, that article I mentioned, I'm talking to China. Most of what I write, I'm actually trying to say to China, hey, there's a reasonable way to do this. I'm not anti-China. I live on the edge of China. I want them to find a better path that will work for the people that live there and secure basic rights. The same with the memorandum. If they reached an agreement around that memorandum with the Dalai Lama, we all know the Dalai Lama is capable of delivering on the agreement, that he has the stature in the Tibetan community to gain acceptance for something that he would agree to. But if he's no longer with us, a decade or so in the future, he tells us, then who is going to have the stature to reach some kind of agreement with China? And, you know, I don't think Tibet is cost-free for China. In fact, Tibet lingers on almost every international outing China has. Not just the Tibetan protesters on the sidelines that are being arrested by police somewhere, but just in general. I think China's neighbors in Southeast Asia look at how China treated this one-time neighbor, you know, that couldn't stand up to them. And I don't think they're encouraged by that. So I think there's a price to pay when China looks too heavy-handed in Tibet. I like to think of Tibet as a barometer of how China is likely to treat a weak partner in any international agreement. And so I think there's a lot to be gained. In many ways, more to be gained than Hong Kong. With Hong Kong, they got New York City, basically. They got a major financial center. No small thing. It's hugely important. Has been, you know, China's always telling Hong Kong, look, we're always helping you guys. Forget that. Hong Kong's help for China is way ahead of whatever China does for Hong Kong. Hong Kong money is all over China. So Hong Kong is a great asset, but I think settling these problems with China's periphery is enormously important for China, and I think is a bit, you know, short-sighted for them not to understand. Can you imagine if they make this problem go away? I think the Dalai Lama's argument is, look, you know, if China doesn't abuse our rights, doesn't repress our people, well, we're not going to live on the edge of the Himalayas without engaging the Chinese economy. The Chinese economy can be enormously important for us because we're going to be, if we were independent, we would be an independent country lodged between China and India. There's no way we would do anything without dealing with those two people, okay? But if that's not an option, we're going to be an autonomous area, then the Dalai Lama is kind of arguing that there's advantage to it. But if China's not willing to deal with Tibet in a way that respects the culture and traditions of Tibetan people and their identity, then that advantage is not there. It's erased. So they can make their problem go away. The Tibetans don't have the ability to make the problem go away because they don't have the power to do so. But the Chinese government can make this problem disappear, and I think it would be to their great advantage. I don't think.
Why are they not doing it? Like this must be like one of the most existential, opening the can of worms questions. Why can't they see this?
Well, that's why I think that the Hong Kong issue is so important. It tells you that they got a blind spot. It's kind of like communist DNA to control everything. So even though Hong Kong is this thriving metropolis that can only benefit them, and before they started mucking around in Hong Kong, there was no independence cause at all, and still it's an infinitesimal minority. This is a no-brainer. But it seems that these officials in cahoots with Hong Kong's pro-Beijing camp it's not in their DNA. They just don't know how to do that. I think Immanuel Kant years ago made this idea of democratic peace, that countries that behave internally tend to project that's the way they behave externally. You know, so if you're a republic inside, you're probably going to treat your neighbors better. If you're a democracy inside, you're probably going to treat your neighbors better. If you're a dictatorship inside, you somehow don't know how to stop being a dictatorship, because you look at the Communist Party today, they're very insecure. All this repression is not because they're feeling powerful. It's because they're feeling vulnerable. And so there are no leaders willing to take those steps that you and I see as common sense. And I would like them to take the steps. Nobody wishes China, to suffer. There's 1 billion people there, and many of us have Chinese friends. We want the country to do well. We just don't want them stepping all over our heads. We want them to be good neighbors, good people to deal with. And I think that's the government in power just has a hard time with that. It's a blind spot as far as I can tell. Any others? Okay, I really appreciate it. I love coming here to see friends I have here, and I thank you for your attention.
Before we close this session, I would like to thank Professor Michael Davis for the very insightful presentation. I'm sure we all have learned so many new things about Hong Kong and Hong Kong's the rule of law and the basic law that they practice in the Hong Kong. On behalf of TBI also, we would like to thank Professor Goyal and Professor Michael Davis for having an interaction with the TBI researchers before this session. So on this note, I would end this session, and thank you for coming here and listen with patience. Thank you.